Hello and welcome aboard, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Captain Kib, signing on today, and today we're going to be starting a brand new series called MechBay. And in MechBay, we're going to go over the various mechs one by one in the BattleTech universe. And to start off, I'm going to be breaking this down even further to help this out, is we'll also be doing it in the basic technical readout. So, we'll be starting with the Succession Wars technical readout, and we'll work our way up from there, slowly but surely, into 3057, and so on and so on. So, first off, I thought we'd start off by talking about one of my favorite mechs of all time, the KGC 0000, or more aptly known, the King Crab. This mech weighs in at 100 tons. Now, while it's one of the heavier assault mechs, it does have some drawbacks already from this. Having a cruising speed of 32 kilometers per hour and a top speed of 54 kilometers per hour makes the mech awfully slow, and getting it into position and just maneuvering in general is going to be a pain. Not to mention the torso twisting is also notably slow, so anything that outflanks this mech will find itself in a distinct advantage over the King Crab. Now, unsurprisingly, the King Crab also has no jump jets. This also hammers home the inability to maneuver properly, making it very easy for lighter mechs, such as like the Spider, for example, if anyone has played that disaster of a game called MechWarrior Online. Oh, goodness gracious, where it just hops and hops around, blasting you in the back, and you just can't quite turn to get it, and it just kills you. Yeah, that's rather unfortunate, but in most instances, the King Crab will always be supported by a full lance, and a good King Crab player and a good lance will always have proper support, always watching its rear and using the King Crab to sort of push the frontal assault. The King Crab has an exorbitant amount of heavy armor on the front, making it capable of withstanding repeated blows from enemy lances, which makes it a perfect tank to distract the enemy forces as you make in a steady, slow, very slow advance into the enemy lines. Now, the King Crab is not completely without its armaments. It is armed with 2 Imperator D autocannons. These puppies are capable of pounding through even the heaviest armor of an assault mech. Those alone should make you worried. Not to mention its, frontal armor. You're never going to pound through it before it pounds through you. At least, when you're confronting a King Crab, always try to outmaneuver, outflank, outposition it, or at least bring a lot of DACA with, because you're going to want to pummel that armor off. And the legs, let me tell you. If you can knock out a leg on one of these things, it will be virtually useless, let alone an arm. The arms are relatively durable, but the legs are less so. Honestly, if you're ever going to encounter one of these things, you're going to want to go for the rear armor plating. Now, it also has a Doombud long-range missile rack 15. These things, if anyone who is pummeled with it for too long start to run away, and your back is exposed to that, or your left leg or right leg is wounded, yeah, those things are going to slowly tear right through that. And topped off with a 1 Magnum Mark III heavy laser, that's going to go and core you out real fast. So, when encountering these things, be fairly worried about it, and if you're also piloting one of them, nothing hurts than modifying your King Crab and equipping it with more ACs. My personal build, I always like to slap on as many ACs as possible and just give them the DACA of their life. It is utterly satisfying. Just go to that boom, 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 boom. These tank cannons just pummel the living daylights out of any poor sob who is unfortunate to encounter one of these things. Now, a little bit of history behind our King Crab is it was introduced towards the end of the Star League era. Commander Kerensky wanted a mech that could cripple and destroy any mech in its path, and do it in almost a single salvo if at all possible. Now, it was designed with that intention, and it ended up succeeding in most regard. However, it obviously cannot quite destroy mechs in single salvos, save for lights. Lights it'll fucking destroy it. Like, it'll tear off an arm or a leg, or hell, it'll even core the little poor son of a bitch out with those 2 AC cannons. Truly disastrous thing to encounter if you're playing a light, to say the absolute least. Its role, however, was a rather simple one. It's to crush and kill everything, and that kind of remains to this day in 3025, almost, 3 freaking centuries later. The King Crab is still seen service. However, its primary factor was destroyed on Mars in the first Succession War. This was rather unfortunate, making it very hard to produce these things, and especially with the loss of technology and not being able to repair or make mechs, it was left to automated factories to sort of make replacement spare parts and things like that, which made it an utter disaster in order to see some of the King Crabs out there. In fact, I think it's actually rather hard in the first, or no, not the first Succession War, but like the third Succession War and the fourth Succession War to even encounter a king crab because of the lacking parts and, you know, the chassis being so hard to produce. I mean, that goes without saying for most mechs at that point. But that's a story for another time about relic mechs and how these mechs are, you know, passed down from generation to generation. And throughout the Succession Wars, not to dilly-dally too much into another thing, but that's how the whole mech warriors came about, you know, the idea of like inheriting these ancient war machines that were, you know, it could have been in the hands of a Star League soldier, and then, you know, passed down into a House Lord's possession, to a pirate's possession, to being, you know, scattered its parts across, you know, via different salvage, and like its arm is off in the, you know, the rimward periphery, and its its leg is over by the, you know, inner sphere. Those parts and pieces will slowly start spreading out. So basically, what you have is a conglomerate of, you know, messes, if you will, compared to what they originally were, being that most factories in that time point were automated. But not to dilly-dally too much, just want to get that out there, because in that way, for future reference in this series, if you know, watch this video first, assuming, you'll be like, oh, okay, that makes sense as to why it's so wonky with the parts and stuff, which is a big deal, by the way. Factories play an important role, and their destruction and maintenance is very important in how that mech will evolve and change throughout the timeline. But again, not to dilly-dally too much on that subject. One other important note I'd like to say before we move on to the next subject is it doesn't have quite the ammo capacity. That is a huge drawback. If I recall correctly, the ACs and most missile storage capacity is very small, so expending ammunition at a target that you can't guarantee hits off of, and it, you know, is too wonky. Lining up shots is important with this mech, because if you run out of ammunition with this mech, you will literally just be a heavy assault mech with, you know, like a laser on the basic variant builds, and even most of the builds, you know, you don't really see laser variants too much, because it's more of a traditional mech, if I like to say traditional, with cannons and Daka machines and explosion and ammunition that can detonate and blow up your fucking torso. Goodness gracious. You know, there are some things that are good to have a Gauss rifle around, and that is the not having the ammunition explode. The other unfortunate part is having the magnets go off and, you know, rip up the mech. But, you know, details. We don't want that happening. Now, like I said, with the lacking storage of ammunition makes it, you don't see them, like, when you shoot a mech, you're going to be unloading a hellstorm of a barrage into them, but only when you have the target. If you don't have the target, or you can't quite make the target, don't fire, because this fucker, when it runs out of ammunition, is going to be hard to use. And in most video game adaptations, you won't be able to use it in melee, because they don't have that functionality in the video games for some reason. It drives me up to no end. And with no jump jet capabilities, the one kind of melee aspect that they had in the video games, where you could jump onto another mech and make it sad about it existing ever, especially if you're a Highlander. But, yeah, without that ability, I mean, it really is terrible. And the idea of the king crab was that it could also use those claws, like, you know, construction bits, and clamp them down and, like, pull and rip, tear, you know, twist sections off like a crab, you know? Clank, clank. But details. Either way, it is a fucking solid mech. However, with that in mind, you know, as long as you know that the video game adaptations, and, you know, with it being so slow as it is, even in the tabletop adaptation, that's the fucking core philosophy. The tabletop, you will not be able to quite catch up. You're going to be like, can you slow down, buddy? I'm trying to get you. I mean, you can still use it as a tank, but I just want to stress that you're going to want to use this very carefully. And, you know, while it is pretty fucking armored to the teeth, it is not the heaviest armored in the world, so it will, you know, succumb to anything that it's not able to kill within, like, you know, a few fucking salvos. That's the entire idea of the king crab, is to take on the hits and then just delete the problem and be like, all right, you hit me, all right, hit me with your best shot. He, like, you know, gently slaps you, and then you just fucking snap his neck. Like, that's the equivalent of what the king crab is trying to do. Not to dilly-dally even more than I already do, but now to the next subject. Now, there were a couple of other variants besides the Quadra Zero KGC. There was the KGC 010 variant, which is an extraordinarily rare king crab variant. It uses 2 experimental PPCs that do not use the outer barrel style of coolant, and instead had cooling spines on it, towards the back, which gave it a very weird look. Not to mention it had an Holly SRM 6, which, you know, really devastating for close-range quarters combat if anything got too close. Now, the PPCs did make it heat up quite a bit. However, its firepower with the same idea of crush, kill, and destroy everything in its path quite worked out. Two PPCs being that they worked. Now, again, it was less favored. It was a less favored design using experimental, wonky technology that wasn't 100% all there yet, and not to mention that the KGC Quadra Zero just did what everything they wanted to do and was less special about it. And with the spines being exposed, it could make it a little bit more vulnerable if mechs get in close range and melee happens, things like that. They can tear off, snap off. That would not be good because that is the source of cooling. Now, most games want to, attest to that sort of minor detail, but it's one thing that sort of helped influence them not to make it. The PPC that was developed by the Hellstar Magna Company. And I don't think we've ever seen it continued its development anywhere else, especially after the destruction of the Mars primary factory for the King Crab models. Now, the KG-010 mounted a LB-10 cluster cannon in each arm. This brought up its firepower to a significant amount. And one other important fact I'd like to note was that the PPC discharge was a sort of a wonky color, and that had to do with the whole coolant system. Now, you wouldn't think that wouldn't be a big deal. However, for troops, tanks, or tank jockeys, and other mech crews, seeing that weird sort of discharge, even though it was pretty much the same kind of PPC, slightly different sort of coolant style, which made it very efficient, by the way, actually spread a lot of terror, because they're like, what the hell is this? Like, new weapons in BattleTech always sort of spark that sort of like, oh shit, what the fuck is it now kind of situation. For example, the introduction of the first battle mechs sort of did that for the poor goddamn Draconis tank jockeys who encountered the first mechs prototypes as they were slowly getting butchered. They were like, oh my god, what in good God's green earth is this? By Bushido code, or whatever the heck those frickin' Dracs believe in. But either way, and the KGZ-010, while it's also rare in the inner sphere, extraordinarily fucking so. Another reason why it is because upon the end of the American Civil War was that Commander Kerensky actually took the designs and some of the models with him when he began his exodus. During the Succession Wars, the plans to make them, of course, like many other great things, were lost. So the Inner Sphere lost the ability to produce them, and the designs went with them into, the deep periphery, the exodus forces of the SLDF. So that's why, another reason why the the clanners are so fucking advanced later on when they come back. Now, there is some stuff that does get lost in the clanner stuff, but that's for a clanner lore video in a later day, talking about how the Exodus wasn't perfect and had Civil War problems, and that's just a huge hunk of stuff. And we can talk about that later on as the return and all the technology that returns from there. But as far as we're concerned, during the Succession Wars period, that technology is sort of lost, and it's extraordinarily rare to come across. Seeing something like that is actually kind of like, holy shit, what the fuck? Like, it's kind of a legend or a myth at this point, especially by 3025 or 3015, depending on if you go by MechWarrior 5 Start Update or BattleTech, the video game. So it sort of is not really seen that much, so that kind of variant just sort of poof to the wind. I mean, you might as well. The odds of you encountering this kind of mech is so small. If you see funky colored PPCs, just start shitting yourself now. But yeah, I think this will conclude this King Crab lore video. I think we talked about it, sizably enough. That's pretty much all you really need to know about the King Crab. It is an interesting mech, and it is by far one of my favorite assault mechs of all time, besides the Direwolf. But we'll get to that at a later point. That's even a different time period altogether, but, details. I'm wondering if you guys like this sort of style of video. Do let me know, because I do plan to keep making them. Was it a little too short? I felt like it was, pretty sizable, pretty hefty. I kind of want to make the battle mech videos, relatively short and concise because, talking about the mechs is interesting, and I don't want to spoil every little detail. Especially we could talk about, like, notable mech warriors who pilot these mech machines. There's all sorts of stuff, like, in the lore. I don't know. But I do hope you guys enjoyed the animations I've made. So yeah, all the hand-drawn frames. This is how it's going to be from now on. Let me know if you like that sort of style. I'll try to adjust as need be. But anyways, as always, guys, you guys have yourself a fantastic day. And this is your host, Captain Gibbs, signing off. So until then, have yourselves a good one.